Why don't we kick off this second EM Insights briefing of our new series of regular, which we're endeavoring to be monthly virtual sessions where we will engage on different topics, bring in our partners and collaborators to share the work that they're doing. But also to just kind of make sure that our stakeholders and the market in general is staying informed about the latest developments, topics, trends, and need-to-knows about what's happening in the voluntary and global carbon markets. My name is Steven D'Onofrio. I'm the Managing Director of Ecosystem Marketplace. In just a few moments, I'll introduce our speakers. But we have just about an hour for today's session. And the first part of it will be presentations and updates about the work that our respective organizations are doing to drive insights through publications, reports, those types of things in communicating the state and trends of carbon pricing and compliance in voluntary carbon markets. But we also will have really interesting presentations today about next generation data systems and infrastructure that's being built for carbon markets to operate more effectively, more efficiently, and with greater standardization. There's a huge amount of interest in these new tools, and so we thought it would be an opportunity to bring them to you. So that's why we have our colleagues here from the World Bank and IETA as co-presenters. So just as a bit of a briefer about Ecosystem Marketplace and the work that we're doing on these fronts, I just wanted to reiterate a couple of things here in terms of our role in the market. Being a nonprofit initiative positions us to work collaboratively and strategically across different stakeholder groups, and we do that through a very objective and an independent lens. And so, for us, we of course want markets to succeed. We want markets to succeed to tackle the environmental challenges that they're set out to tackle. And that fundamentally goes to the points of, is it addressing climate change? Are they, conserving or preserving or safeguarding biodiversity, communities, and other types of co-benefits that go along with these projects? So success is important to reflect on the intention of the market. But way we do that is by operating a global system for being a repository on trade data in the carbon markets and other environmental markets where there is no centralizing system or mechanism such as an exchange that would facilitate that type of price and trade data transparency. So we work directly with a large network of organizations, to improve that, and also work collaboratively, as I'll talk about in a minute, to disseminate that. And then just a little bit about that data in more detail. We have a global network of EM respondents, over 200 organizations that are reporting their carbon trade data to us, as well as other insights and market sentiments that are more the qualitative components about how the market's moving and what's happening in the market. This is largely and most uniquely consisting of project developers who are originating the credits or representing the project proponents to communicate their trades, their sales of the credits, and those sales are going into intermediaries as well as end users. And we track then the intermediaries who are selling those credits along, the value chain. There are dozens of different metrics that go along with those transactions as they're associated to the project ID and the transaction date that allows us to determine their project locations, the standards, the types, the SDGs and co-benefits, as well as we ask questions about the contract, structure. So is it what type of market is it transacting from, primary and secondary? Is it a spot or forward transaction? A bunch of other very useful details. That all gets processed through our system, which I'll talk about in a second. And then historically, as many of you are familiar with, is the State of the Voluntary Carbon Market reports or other market reports that we've produced, such as, the State of Forest Carbon Finance, which we've worked with the World Bank on that report in the past, as well as producing CORSIA price indexes or reference prices for the International Civil Aviation Organization. And then there's a whole lot that we're working on to bring more price transparency to the value of co-benefits and SDGs in the market. So that's historically, how we've disseminated information. And one of the things that I just wanted to talk about as I lead into our presenters today is that with a number of new partnerships and new opportunities for strengthening our systems as ecosystem marketplace, we are moving our respondents, which it's a global herd of over 200 organizations and counting, to move into a more frequent reporting cadence, so that we can publish our State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets reports on a quarterly basis. So we're doing everything we can to modernize our systems to enable that type of trade transparency. And in Q1 of this year, we soft launched what we call the Global Carbon Markets Hub. And that is not something that's available externally to anyone that isn't a current EM respondent or a prospective EM respondent. So that means you're a project developer or a reseller of credits who's reporting your transactions to us. If you're not currently in our stable of organizations, you can email us at hub@ecosystemmarketplace.com. But what we've done with this system is to make the process and the mechanism for disclosure more standardized and more validation ready at the point of entering in the data, which will make our ability to process that data and turn it into analysis and pricing information in more near real time. And then as a respondent, you also get access to our projects database, and we're really looking forward to the coming online in full version of the products that our colleagues here from the World Bank and AIDA will be talking about, because the meta registry aspect, or the component of having a global system of project information that can be standardized, is really exciting to be able to link up into our data platform. And then there's market intelligence tools that we offer to our data providers, our respondents as well. And then also recently we announced a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of State, and this was a really exciting development for us. It has components around capacity building for national governments, sovereigns, where we will be working and thinking about our collaborative relationships that we could have with other entities that are doing this work already, but how we can share this market data in a packaged way, both in knowledge sessions as well as market analytics tools to government stakeholders. And then I just thought I'd highlight here just a few of our collaborators and supporters and partners. And on our call here is World Bank, and we'll talk about the role that we play, a small role that we play in the great work that they do tracking global pricing schemes and carbon crediting programs in the world, both compliance and voluntary, and how we are working to feed in that the data that we have on voluntary markets into those reports, but also the work that we're doing with a number of these other organizations has been really helpful in us building out the systems and navigating the next generation of ecosystem marketplace. So with that, I'll hand it over to our speakers, and just to introduce them briefly, we have Joe Pryor, Senior Climate Change Specialist at the World Bank. Chandra Sinha, who is the global lead of carbon markets and finance at the World Bank, and Simon Henry, the Director of Carbon Market Development at AIDA, the International Emissions Trading Association. So our speakers will be moving efficiently in this process and leave time for Q&A at the end. But the first speaker is Joe Pryor. So Joe, I'm just going to hand over controls to you, and hopefully you're able now to navigate the slides.
Super. Great. Thanks, Stephen. And thanks for the opportunity to present today. And as you mentioned, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the state and trends of carbon pricing. Now, this is an annual report that the World Bank produces, and it's been doing this for almost 2 decades now in various forms. And it touches on a broad sort of gambit of carbon pricing, including carbon taxes and ETSs, but also carbon crediting including the voluntary carbon market. It also touches on like broader incentives within an economy. So with that, and I'll talk a little bit about the readership as well when we talk about the importance of data integrity. Oh, so with that, I'll just see if I can, yep, there we go. The first slide is just to give an overview of the carbon taxes and ETSs and the state of play of them across the world. And this is a useful figure that has become a regular feature of the State and Trends report. And it's a good snapshot of the state of play, showing those jurisdictions with carbon taxes and ETSs that are either in place, under consideration, or scheduled for implementation. But it also shows where some of the gaps are in the various regions and in specific countries. And you can see that around a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions are covered by an ETS or a tax that is currently implemented. Now, since the publication of this report, we've seen a few developments, including the commencement of an ETS in Austria, fixed price ETS in Austria, cap and trade in Washington State. A number of subnational jurisdictions in Mexico have implemented carbon taxes. And probably one of the more significant developments is in Indonesia, where the government has announced the launch of its ETS this year. And that's significant for a few reasons, but it's definitely a promising development. So over the last few years, we've seen ETS prices increase significantly. And this is particularly in the EU ETS, but also in New Zealand and California and a few others. And this tracks the price up until early last year. And we've seen prices since this period largely sort of flatten out with a few increases, but also with increased volatility across many ETS markets. But we have seen in the EU prices exceed 100 euros for the first time. And now it's dipped a bit below that now, but generally prices have been increasing over the last few years. We've also seen carbon tax rates increasing, and this is probably a more promising sign from a policy perspective, because unlike ETSs, carbon tax rates are set by government. So they're more reflective of the ambition in the market than ETSs, which can reflect, or variable price ETSs, which can reflect a range of market attributes. This is a useful figure that shows a couple of tax rates that have been increasing over time, but also it shows a number of the jurisdictions that are setting carbon tax trajectories that are increasing ambition, and that includes Canada and Ireland, but also more recently Singapore and South Africa. And this is another promising sign. But we've also, regardless of those increases that we've seen, generally the prices in economies remain below the levels needed to meet our global mitigation goals. And this is a useful figure to demonstrate two things. The first is the difference in prices across jurisdictions that have implemented taxes and ETSs. And the second thing, if you look, there's that grey band in the middle of this figure, and this is the recommended carbon price by the High-Level Commission on Carbon Pricing on the prices required to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. And what you can see is that the vast majority of prices are below this, and in fact, less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions are within the price ranges needed by 2030. Now, as a result of this increase, particularly in ETS prices, we've seen revenue increase significantly over the last couple of years. Now, this shows 2021, and we've seen similar increase in 2022, where, and for the first time, ETS revenue from auctioning has exceeded that of carbon tax revenue, which is a significant, I guess, milestone in terms of the trajectory of these instruments. We also saw that carbon price revenue exceeded $84 billion in 2021. And just to put that in perspective, in the same year, the voluntary carbon market just tapped over the $1 billion mark. So you can see that this is quite relevant in the carbon crediting space in terms of if and when these mechanisms start to demand carbon credits, it could be significant for the carbon crediting market. And so with that, I can transition a bit to talk about the carbon crediting markets. And there's been a number of developments over the last years. COP26 Article 6 rulebook was a major milestone. It goes a long way to improving certainty. I think there's still a ways to go, particularly in respect to implementation in the voluntary carbon market. And we've seen subsequent negotiations, including at COP27, try to put some meat on the bones of that framework. But one thing it does, it creates a credible path for countries to be able to use mitigation outcomes and potentially credits to achieve NDC goals. And this is really important. The other thing that we've noticed is that we're likely to continue to see market fragmentation. And the classic, I guess, example of this is if an institutional investor asks anyone in the carbon market, what is the carbon price? The answer is always, it depends. And it depends on a range of things. Are you talking about compliance markets, like domestic compliance markets, like ETSs and taxes? Or are you talking about carbon crediting? If so, which standards, which project types, which vintages? And so it really just depends. And that is really reflective, I think, of, particularly in the voluntary carbon market, consumers and companies looking for attributes beyond just credits alone, things like the less tangible things around what the project is, where it's been implemented, and what's underpinning those carbon credits. Now, last year, we tried to look at some definitions around sources of supply and demand in carbon crediting markets. And we've simplified it into like sort of 3 buckets for supply. And I'll just mention these briefly. So international crediting mechanisms, CDM is the best example, domestic crediting mechanisms such as California or Australia or others. And then there's independent crediting mechanisms, those independent standards like VCS and gold standard. And on the bottom, various sources of demand or market segments. And one thing I wanted to highlight is that these markets are not discrete. And it's an important point to note that and this will probably likely continue and even increase over time with various sources of supply in terms of credits being potentially used for a range of demand purposes, both compliance and voluntary. And this makes it a little bit difficult to sort of define and track what's happening in the market, and raises the importance of the work of ecosystem marketplace. And so this is a figure showing, I guess, issuances over the last decade or so. And I just wanted to use this to highlight 2 main things. The first one is that the makeup of the market today is vastly different from how it looked a year ago, 10 years ago, at the height of the Kyoto period. So where it was largely dominated by the CDM in international mechanisms, whereas now it's these independent mechanisms, independent standards, particularly VCS, that is leading the charge, both in terms of volume and also in terms of the increase. And so issuances went up significantly, and we've seen a slight drop off in this year in terms of issuances, but it's still continuing on with the upward trend over this last few years in terms of where the market's going and what we've seen in the period following Kyoto. So this is just a quick map of domestic crediting mechanisms, and I wanted to mention this because this is a bit outside of what ecosystem marketplace tracks, but an important part of the component of the market. And these are just a map of which countries currently have domestic crediting mechanisms. We've seen a few developments over the last year, including the implementation or the investigation of crediting mechanisms in East Asia Pacific, particularly Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And just to draw the link between crediting mechanisms, including independent standards and compliance, domestic compliance markets, is that many of these domestic carbon pricing instruments, that is taxes and ETSs, actually allow offsets. Now, they have restrictions in terms of qualitative restrictions, like the type of units and location of units, and also quantitative restrictions in terms of the volume of credits that can be used for compliance. But they're permitted in many ETSs, And also important to note that a number of carbon taxes also allow credits to be used to offset carbon tax liabilities. And this includes Chile, South Africa, Mexico, but also most recently in Singapore has announced that towards the end of the decade, they'll also allow carbon credits to be used in their tax. And so just my last slide, I just wanted to touch on the, some of the points that Stephen mentioned about the importance of ecosystem marketplaces data. And I've tried to summarize our data collection very simply into three main buckets: carbon taxes and ETSs, domestic crediting, and voluntary carbon markets. And ecosystem marketplaces data is critical for our understanding of the voluntary carbon market and what's happening, particularly in the non-exchange traded aspects of this market, which makes up a big proportion. And I wanted to emphasize it, and Stephen went and highlighted the importance from being able to inform their insights, but the use of this data goes beyond ecosystem marketplace, and the State and Trends is a well-read and well-used report. And so this is an important component of it. It's used by policymakers in various countries. It's used by researchers and analysts. And having this data is really important for the integrity to be able to provide sound and credible insights into how carbon pricing is tracking. So with that, Stephen, I'll leave it there, and I think I'll hand it over to whoever's next.
Thanks very much. Chandra is next. Chandra, just 1 second. Let me hand over the controls to you. Over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. And I wanted to pivot a little bit to talking more generally about the data infrastructure for a transparent market. I think you saw from the presentation that Joe provided on the importance of market intelligence and how currently we, the World Bank, collect and report on the data, but we think that there is a lot of room to move towards more active management of this data infrastructure. So, okay, I'm getting my feel for the control. It's quite sensitive. So the fundamental element of the data infrastructure and to move towards the end-to-end digital ecosystem for the carbon market is the registry. Registries that have the carbon assets issued in them. And broadly, I think you heard from Joe about the independent standards. They have their own registries. There are the UNFCCC registries. The World Bank has a registry linked to the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. So there are multiple types of registries, but the new entrants, particularly from the host countries, the developing countries, are going to be the country registries, and we've seen over the last few months growth in demand for looking at the types of registries that can be provided to these countries in order to manage their domestic crediting mechanism, their other forms of carbon asset creation, and for the linkages to the international market as well. And as the number of these registries grow, the need for anchoring information that comes from these registries in a data layer that tracks across different standards, different country registries, different domestic programs is going to become increasingly important. And that's the discussion that that we've had over the last 3-4 years in order to build what we call the metadata layer, which Simon will talk about in more detail. But we view this as the anchor for an end-to-end, credible, transparent data system that will facilitate the growth of the carbon markets. And certainly, we think that the transaction layers, the exchanges, the bilateral trades that occur within the registry layer, within the registries or between registries will get reflected in the data layer that you see, and will facilitate the development of a range of services which are indicated, including the hub that ecosystem marketplace is developing, where in addition to the registry information, you will have information coming from the transactions. And certainly we think that all of this promotes greatly the ability of particularly the countries to report their Article 6 transactions, or report on their pricing mechanisms, and obviously then move towards a much more transparent system. One work that is described now and shown here in the slide is moving upstream into creation of digital ecosystem for monitoring, reporting, and verification, both at the project level, project and program level, but also to begin to move towards national reporting of mitigation activities, so that you have a more systematic approach, more transparent approach of identifying activities that are taking place in different countries, and potentially to even allow for verification to be carried out through these centralized databases or the national MRV systems, which would certainly increase the speed of settlement, certainly reduce the cost, and lead to a much more efficient overall move in the carbon market. So these are the overall components of the digital ecosystem that we're developing as a part of the Climate Warehouse program. And certainly the partnership here between the multilaterals, which includes the UNFCCC, UNDP, EBRD, the European Space Agency, and the World Bank, is to develop interoperable modular components of this ecosystem, which will facilitate the growth and of the transparent carbon market. So within that framework, perhaps I'll hand it over to Simon to talk about the metadata layer of the Climate Action Data Trust. So over to you, Simon.
Thanks very much, Chandra. And we'll go to my slides next.
Yeah, let me hand over the controls to you, Simon. Here you go.
Thanks very much. Okay, so I have a couple of slides to talk a little bit about the Climate Action Data Trust, which Chandra has obviously touched on there in his presentation. And I wanted to start, I'm jumping ahead too much. I wanted to start by talking a little bit more about what the Climate Action Data Trust is. And really, it's a global platform to link, aggregate, and harmonize carbon credit data. So at the moment, as we know, and as we've heard from the previous speakers, there's a growing number of registries all around the world, both domestic registries, compliance registries, registries in the voluntary market. And in turn, all of them hold a huge amount of data on the projects that are operating under their standards and the assets that are being held on those registries. And that data is very fragmented and disparate. It's in a huge number of locations, huge number of websites around the world. Often the terminology across registries and standards is different. And it's difficult to really get a global holistic view of activity in the market for carbon credits. And in turn, that lack of transparency can hinder the full adoption of these mechanisms to address climate change. So what the Climate Action Data Trust is trying to do is to try to bring transparency and harmonization to that challenge. So it is a open source, decentralized platform to, as I say, aggregate and harmonize data from registries. So any registry can participate and can volunteer to share their data with the platform, and we hope over time that we will build up a large volume of data in the market. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see the three founders of this initiative: the World Bank, IETA, and the Government of Singapore. Climate Action Data Trust is an entity in itself that is now incorporated in Singapore, and the government has been supportive of the initiative to date. And as Chandra mentioned, really it's a spin out from the work that the World Bank have done under the Climate Warehouse. So a lot of this was tested and trialed, prototyped under the Climate Warehouse program And I'll come on to talk a little bit about that. So I think maybe, am I missing a slide?
Simon, actually, it looks like it may have been, if you scroll back a few, it looks like it was tacked onto the end of Chandra's slides. Two more. Yep, one more. There we go.
Oh, okay, there we go. Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
so this was the slide I wanted to talk to. So this provides hopefully a little bit more detail on how the platform works. So in these discussions, we often talk about layers: a transaction layer, a registry layer, a metadata layer, and a services layer. You'll see the CAD Trust logo there under the metadata layer. That is the bit that we are operating and managing. And as you'll see from the diagram, we will be taking data from registries into this open source decentralized platform. And one of the key components of Climate Action Data Trust is the data dictionary, the data model that has been developed. So this essentially, I sort of visualize this as really being the fields in the database. There's about 40 fields. And this is really the types of data or the categories of data which registries will share with us. And in turn, that data model has been developed through a long process of prototyping and simulating that the World Bank operated. They ran 3 simulations with a whole range of stakeholders in the market to identify the fields in that database, identify the fields in the data model. So hopefully, with the intention of that is to harmonize and make the data that is coming into the system comparable across registries. So whereas at the moment, a lot of that terminology doesn't necessarily map onto each other when you look across the registries and the standards. So we're trying to build that harmonization in by defining a common data model that registries can share data under those categories. So that's what we're building out at the moment, is this registry layer, working with registries to onboard to the system and share their data. And as I say, this is an open source system, so any registry can access the application, onboard to our system and start sharing data. And there's a number of ways that they can share data with us. But certainly our intention, our hope, especially with the bigger registries, is that we will have API connections with these registries so that data is shared in real time. And the registries themselves remain the ultimate owner. They remain the owner of the data. Really, what the CAD Trust is doing is rebroadcasting data that they own and that they already share in the public domain. But we are putting it in a single location, harmonizing it with that data model, and then making sort of fully available to the market in a single location. So that's what our focus at the moment. But it's worth touching on the bottom of the slide, the services layer. And this is a piece of work that's to come a bit later in our program. But the intention here is that organizations who are providing services to the market will be able to host a node of our platform, access all this data in the format they require, and then use that to provide commercial services, or use it as the basis to then provide commercial services from. So we're really viewing Climate Action Data Trust as a foundation stone to the market. And hopefully it becomes a bit of a hub so that lots of organizations are therefore referencing or using the same original source data, so that as we see more analysis, more services being developed in the market, more innovation in the market, a lot of these organizations will be referencing the same data set, so that the services they provide themselves will be more comparable across providers. And ultimately this, we hope, will build trust, transparency in market mechanisms, and sort of further and enhance their deployment. We've also added a box on there for Ecosystem Marketplace to sort of try to conceptualize how Ecosystem Marketplace might interact with this ecosystem that's being developed. So in this example, Ecosystem Marketplace could host a node, access the data coming in from the registries, and then complement that with a lot of the work that Ecosystem Marketplace do on pricing. So the survey work that they do to gather to gather pricing in the voluntary market. Also complement that with pricing data from exchanges, additional data that you may be taking from the registries which is not captured in Climate Action Data Trust. And then, that data we hope will then become, as I say, the foundation for, more analysis and sort of higher value products and more transparency in the market. So that's a little, hopefully a snapshot of how we envisage this system and a little bit of an insight into our program of work that is coming up. So if I flick back to my original slides, there we go. So in terms of key value propositions, I mean, I've touched on some of these already. Obviously, the data model, that's the tool to harmonize the data coming in from all these registries. Transparency is obviously another big component of what we're trying to provide here. As I mentioned, the fragmentation in the market is already significant and is likely to become more the fragmentation will only increase probably as more and more registries and systems come online. We're already seeing many more standards and registries emerge in the voluntary market. We're seeing national systems for domestic carbon pricing systems, and we also we know that about 150 countries are also interested in using Article 6 in order to help deliver their NDCs. So, very quickly, you can imagine an ecosystem with many hundreds of registries. And it becomes quite difficult then to, for a single organization to go out and gather data on those many hundreds of registries. So what Climate Action Data Trust is doing is trying to establish itself as a hub where registries can themselves come to Climate Action Data Trust and share data, rather than individuals or organizations go out to those many hundreds and try to gather data. So the transparency is key. Corresponding adjustments in the blue box. The role of CAD Trust under Article 6. I think there's many roles that CAD Trust could play as markets emerge under Article 6, and we're interacting closely with the UNFCCC as they also develop their systems and develop the rule book for markets there. I mean, a simple characterization or a simple role that CAD Trust may play is just in providing visibility over what credits have been correspondingly adjusted, which credits have been authorized by host countries and therefore come with corresponding adjustments. So in our system, these credits could be tagged. That's a similar role that CAD Trust may play for other initiatives in the voluntary market. So for instance, we see the Integrity Council of the voluntary carbon market coming forward very soon with their core carbon principles. And we know that credits will be tagged as being compliant with the CCPs soon. Credits are also compliant with a number of other systems like CORSIA or domestic markets. And again, those sorts of tags could be visible in Climate Action Data Trust, so that users and market participants, when they're analyzing the sorts of units in the market, they'll have full transparency over whether a unit can be used in South Africa, whether it can be used in CORSIA, whether it comes with a CCP tag. So again, the transparency there will be really key. I wanted to say a few words on the actual structure and the governance of the Climate Action Data Trust. The Climate Action Data Trust itself is actually a non-profit organization, a company incorporated in Singapore. As I mentioned, that the government there have been supportive of our establishment. And this slide shows how we are structured. So we have a small board of directors, which is comprised of representatives from the 3 founding organizations. In turn, they are supported by a council, which is currently made up of 10 representatives. So we have 6 government representatives from Singapore, UK, Japan, Bhutan, Senegal, and Chile. And then also 4 representatives from the main standards in the voluntary markets. We have Verra, Gold Standard, ACR, and the Global Carbon Council. And then we're also looking to add a couple of additional seats on that council at some point this year. So the council in itself is a true public-private partnership, and it will be their job really to develop the high-level strategy and work program of the CAD Trust as we become fully established. And they will interact with the board. In turn, the council is supported by these two advisory bodies, the technical committee and the user forum. We established the technical committee earlier this year, made up of technical experts, as the name suggests, so representatives again from registries and governments and sort of data analytical type organizations. We're now in the process of putting together a user forum, which is likely to be a slightly larger body made up of representatives from the market, really to provide a sounding board for the rest of the governance groups to test out ideas and also hear from the market on whether the platform is meeting their needs. And as I say, we're in the process of putting that in place at the moment. All of this organization is supported by the Secretariat, which is really the role that IETA, this is where IETA comes in. So we are in the process of establishing, well, we're supporting that role, and we're in the process of establishing a dedicated team. So we're hiring staff to run the Secretariat for the CAD Trust. And I should add as well that the entity itself is a not-for-profit entity. Obviously, our intention here is about delivering a public good. It's about delivering trust and transparency in carbon markets. This is not a commercial operation, and that's, as you'd expect, given the entities involved. So that's a quick overview of how we're structured. And then my last slide, just to touch a little bit on our work program. Last year, we were in an inception phase, really getting up and running, doing some fundraising, establishing that legal entity, and really spinning this out from the World Bank's Climate Warehouse program into an entity in itself, putting some of that governance in place as well. We're currently in what we call this interim period, the next 2 years till the end of 2024, where we become operational and really start to roll out the platform and drive its adoption. So there's a number of tasks and items on our work program that we're focusing on at the moment. And it's worth touching as well on the funding, that the last row on this table, we've raised some money to get us to where we're at the moment. We need to raise some further funds to really fully roll out the platform, drive adoption, hire the Secretariat, etc. As I mentioned on the previous slide, our intention here is to deliver a public good. So, our intention is to do fundraising to run the platform and to manage our operations. Once we go into what we call our permanent governance phase, the last column on this table, the intention is to sort of transition to a self-sustaining finance model, potentially still supported with grant funding. That will be a topic for consideration for our council to consider what that model will look like, whilst also meeting the needs of delivering a public good. So that's a key issue for the council's consideration, towards 2025 and onwards. And then once we're in that sort of middle of the decade phase, really, I think the CAD Trust will become fully independent, hopefully a key piece of infrastructure in the market, and a close interaction with the UNFCCC as Article 6 in itself becomes more established. And there'll be, I'm sure, lots of discussion over the role of the CAD Trust in the UNFCCC systems, and we'll be building out that services layer and driving further adoption. But hopefully by that stage, CAD Trust is established and an independent entity in its own right. And that brings me to the end of my slides, so my slide pack. So Stephen, I'll hand back to you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so we have 15 minutes for questions. A lot of questions that have come in. My team is in the process of compiling them. And I think some of the questions that were for you, Simon, about your timeline, where things stand, in terms of the CAD Trust development, those have been answered in that last slide. And I think I just would like to, say, over the years, we've we've taken on a little bit of this duty. It's not our, primary responsibility, as I've mentioned, is to, but the sort of like necessary duty of trying to create some sense of all the different registry data that's out there. And it's no fault, to how a very young market has grown, but there's a lot of fragmentation in that. And so this work is really important to bring some harmonization and to standardization into that registry data set, as we're trying to do on the trade data set. And there's clear kind of connection points, which we're really excited about. So anyway, thank you for Joe, Chandra, and Simon for those questions or those presentations. I'm just looking at the list of questions here. So I think maybe just one quick follow-up from you, Simon, is when will the CAD Trust be available for users? I think the timeline showed development phases, but are there certain milestones you need to hit first before you actually can bring in users to the system?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So there's two components to that answer, I think. One is onboarding of registries. So we're in the initial phase of that, and we have some of the smaller registries sort of onboarded, but we're working with the larger ones to integrate their systems. And in many cases, those registries actually need to build a bit of infrastructure at their end. So that's probably, before we have some of the bigger registries onboarded, I think we're looking at a few months. And then another component to that question is we're also in the process of building what we currently call a public observer node. So that's really the public portal to view this data. I think we may come up with a different name for it at some point. But that's also something we're focusing on. So I think it's probably middle of the year before we've really got a significant volume of data for the general users to access and visualize.
Great. And I'm trying to see if I can space out some of these questions with the other speakers, but there are also, I think, some interest in trying to contextualize, this data with, I think, Chandra, you pointed out a layer for MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification, the geospatial side. But I think it gets to the sciences piece of this, of being able to track, climate progress or climate action, through these data systems. And I guess the fundamental question is how much original analysis or kind of derivation of the registry data will, the World Bank and AIDA do in your data tools, from the registry data versus relying on on those registries to provide you with the data for the CAD Trust and for the Climate Warehouse.
So maybe, Stephen, just to add a bit, I think the idea contained in the services layer that Simon presented is to provide this data for analysis by a whole range of service providers. Right now, there are emerging service providers who do rating for underlying reported projects that are on the registries. I think the idea for us is to have a much bigger data set, which would allow service providers to do a lot of the due diligence on the progress and integrity, on the transparency of the market as a whole. And we see the linkages to the national MRV systems that are required under Article 13 to contribute to that process as well. And as I indicated in my slide, the idea for us is to integrate the national MRV systems with the national registries or registries that countries designate for their international carbon markets into a system that allows market participants and other stakeholders to do the necessary due diligence. And this is obviously a work in progress. The idea for us is to build interoperable modular system which are open to API type linkages to create a system which the service providers can use to provide that additional level of due diligence, if you will.
Thanks, Chandra. Anything to add to that, Simon, or?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to say that I hope that initiatives like this can drive a sophistication, I think, or a advancement in the types of systems we have in the marketplace. You know, a lot of actually one of our members said to me, which is a nice way of characterizing it, I think, that, you know, transparency in the market is not access to a 300-page document on a registry about a certain project, but it's having the data in the 300-page document in a digital format, and it's accessible, and you can, you know, look it up, and it's similar or comparable to data from another standard in another part of the world. So I hope that through initiatives like this, through, you know, the rollout of sort of digital tools, and improvement in systems underpinning the market, we will just see, you know, the sophistication of the data and the tools available to the market grow over time, which in turn will drive that transparency, which we've obviously spoken about.
And then maybe for you, Joe, talking about the State and Trends report, asking for some light on the trends towards and/or regulatory influence on quality, as well as things like permanence, additionality, and rigor in general of the projects, reductions or removals. So, you know, is the compliance side or policy, you know, interactions with the you know, project development or influencing project development in certain ways over voluntary influence.
Yeah, so I think we've seen historically where governments put in qualitative restrictions on the types of credits that can be used. So in Australia, when we had an ETS, there was certain types of credits, particularly from nuclear and large hydro, and there were similar restrictions in the EU as well, that were just not allowed. So I think that's part of the prospect of having qualitative restrictions on these individual considerations that are of importance to that general market. And I think that linked to another question that was about the dotted line between, they call them voluntary registries and compliance markets. And I think sort of ties in with this as well, where we already are seeing in a number of taxes in particular, but also in ETSs, the potential to use credits from independent standards. So VCS and gold standard can be used in the South Africa carbon tax. They can be used in the Colombia carbon tax. And the important point here is it's not any type of credit. They have very tight restrictions on the type of projects, and also in terms of geographical restrictions that have to be from those countries. So I think that you can see that the compliance market in those respects starting to, and CORSIA has the same sort of restrictions in terms of not just the standard, but also the unit type of that's allowed. So I think you can see compliance markets driving, you know, what's allowed, and I think then the market will then determine the value of those credits more generally.
Thanks, Joe. And there are some other questions here coming in. And I'm going to try to consolidate a few, but it looks like just also trying to make sure that as new systems are built, that there is this sort of interoperability or interconnection moments, because we don't want to see duplication, but also we want to make sure there's not just duplication of efforts, but duplication of tracking of this. And I can say, you know, for sure, you know, right now, knowing that there are probably several organizations consolidating registry data into one place, and there is a lot of duplication of work that's going on. But also, you know, as we are very focused on the trade data side, making sure that, you know, we are counting distinct and unique transactions versus counting the same transaction if it's reported by an original seller and going through a reseller. So I think that question has a lot of different touch points in this kind of day-to-day work that we do as individual organizations, but also as we're building these systems. My sense, and I'll let Simon and Chandra speak to this, but I mean, this is front and center for us as we're developing the Carbon Hub. on our side, the platform, so that sellers that are project developers will indicate if they're using a reseller, and then that reseller, as they're reporting to us, the trades can be kind of cross-referenced, and we can determine that it is identical trades. That requires things that are unique identifiers like project IDs and potentially also serial numbers. So as we ask for these systems to be more efficient and to do more, we also will be asking, more for more transparency from the market. So it's a balancing act in a lot of ways of what will the market provide, and what will we be able to get versus, what can we achieve in terms of, all those efficiencies. That's from EM side. I don't know if Aida or the World Bank would like to, comment on that as well.
Well, I think it touches on a very valid point that there isn't much harmonization across systems, and market implementation is working with a number of client countries, helping them develop registries, build out registries. UNDP doing something similar. And I mean, certainly our hope is that as these countries develop their systems and come online, that these, there will be immediate compatibility with, for instance, the CAD Trust or with other systems, so that you start to have that interoperability and harmonization of data terminology, for instance. And touching as well, Stephen, on just more on what you said in the second part of your point, our user forum, I think that's sort of almost a bit of a reference case for how we think our user forum may operate, where users will come to us saying, we need data in this format, or we need the platform to have this functionality, which doesn't currently exist. Can we try to address that somehow? And in that sense, the forum will become hopefully a bit of a platform to collectively think through problems and put in place solutions for the market as a whole.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Simon. So we're at the last 2 minutes of the session. So I want to give everybody a chance just to give a final comment or two. I mean, Joe, I know you have your big conference coming up and the launch of the report you've been working on over the past several months. And, Chandra and Simon, if there's anything else about, timelines, where to go, for resources, you can also throw links into the chat. But maybe, just for closing comments from Joe, go ahead first, and then Chandra and Simon.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, nothing from me. I think you already gave us a good plug. In the end of May, we'll be releasing our updated state and trends report at Innovate for Climate. So encourage everyone to check it out, and along with all of the data that is included at the carbon pricing dashboard. I encourage everyone to have a look at what we've got, and we're trying to make improvements over the next coming years. Thanks.
From my side, Stephen, I think the idea for us to operationalize the Climate Action Data Trust works in parallel with providing the registry infrastructure to many of the developing countries that you referred to, and in partnership with other multilaterals, in particular UNDP, UNFCCC, EBRD, in order to provide the infrastructure which is modular and is interoperable. I think that those are the key, because as you pointed out, there's going to be a substantial level of effort in order to put the market infrastructure in place, and we want that infrastructure to be able to essentially talk to each other and create the necessary data infrastructure which allows greater transparency and trackability. So I look forward to working with the stakeholder group. You're interested, a lot of interest I saw in the Q&A. Would love to work on that, and you can find us through the Climate Warehouse website.
Thanks, Chandra.
Maybe just wrap up on my side. I mean, we look forward to working closely with organizations like Ecosystem Marketplace and others. I think a lot of us have very similar or aligned objectives about trying to bring transparency to the market, build trust and confidence, and expand the use of market mechanisms. So we look forward to working with lots of stakeholders in the market, and further information can be found on our website, climateactiondata.org. And we hope that over the coming months, we'll have more announcements to make, more products to show on the website as our system really becomes operational. So please stay tuned.
Thank you, Simon, and have a great conference in Portugal this week. I guess the closing side from ours, closing remarks from Ecosystem Marketplace, just that all of this work is incredibly important. We're trying to tackle this in bite-sized pieces, but also with big visions. So if there are other stakeholders out there looking to get involved, contact us. This is our second, as I mentioned, in monthly EM Insights briefings. Really appreciate Simon, Chandra, Joe, you being with us here today, collaborating with us in the work that we do. And as I mentioned about the hub, this is in soft launch mode on our side for our respondents. It's not available by going to our website. So if you are a data provider or looking to be a data provider, contact us directly and we'll get you onboarded. But anyway, have a great rest of your days. Really appreciate everyone's time, and we'll talk to you soon.